So many times when we feel like, okay, now I've got to prove myself, I got to prove why they need to work with me, we make ourselves the hero, and in our story, we just start talking about all the amazing things we did for that client. That is not going to help. They need to see how you came alongside that client and how the client won the day. Because if it's just about you, that's not what you want. If it's just like, well, hey, I worked with this university and I grew up by 30%. Okay, that's nice, but more so we were able to work with the team so that they could feel confident and continue to grow, which resulted in growing it by 30%.
The trick is, don't make the stories all about you. Discover your customers' stories and what they're facing, and then tell stories that relate and that celebrate the successes other people have had, and all the details of you in that are much less important. Welcome to another episode of Sippin Matcha and helping you make more sales. I am your host and matcha maker, Scott Greening, and I bring anonymous sales questions to my wife and sales trainer, Brooke Greening. We're going to bring her in just a moment, but I want to invite you into the conversation in two ways today. First, you can always leave an anonymous sales question that we can use on a future episode to help you out at buildingmomentum.info/matcha, and you can leave your question there and we'll be happy to answer it and get it on a future episode. And then secondly, if you would like to like or review or share, that's always welcome, and so we're excited about that. We're especially excited about that today as we bring in Brooke, because it is our 20th episode. You start a you start a podcast and you're not sure where it's going to go or what's involved in that. And we certainly did that at the beginning. You can go all the way back to the very first episodes and see Brooke by herself. That didn't last very long. Now you get the joy of both of us.
No, it did not last long. I did not like just staring into a camera and talking.
Now you get to stare into a camera with me making snide remarks.
I love it. It's my favorite.
Along the way. Yeah, we are excited and we are appreciating those that are engaging and finding the stuff helpful. So here is today's question. We kind of teased this a little bit with our last episode. So for the first time in our podcast history on episode 20, we have a little bit of I don't know if you can call it a mini series but we have a follow-up, a back-to-back question. So last week we talked about what role does story play in sales, and you helped us remember that the most important stories to get are your customers' stories about what they're facing, not necessarily sharing your own, but there is a place for sharing your own stories and telling good stories. And so today's question, the follow-up to last week, is this: how do you tell stories that sell? How do you tell stories that sell? I might be a great storyteller to our kids or to my daughter Busy when I'm putting her to bed, but those stories probably aren't going to be selling a lot of business. They involve princesses named Busy and the rest of her classmates.
Yes. And you do great storytelling when you're preaching and things like that. But again, that's not exactly what we're talking about. And I don't want people to feel like it's this ping pong effect. It's don't tell stories, do tell stories, don't tell stories, do tell stories. It's not that. We want to be able to tell stories in all of our sales conversations. But what I really wanted to emphasize last week is we do it too soon. We do it before we actually know what story is going to be able to resonate with the person that we're talking to. And that hurts us. And it also hurts them in regards to feeling is this a good fit? Should we be able to move forward? So that's why we focused a lot last week, just in regards to, we need to know their story first. We need to know the problems they're facing first before we come into play. That's really important. So that's how we're starting off this podcast. You need both, but you need to get the order right.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about that. How did you figure out that these stories and getting them in the right order is the right way to do, and then the right types of stories to tell?
Yeah. So this reminds me a while back ago when I used to work at a place called Oxford Learning Center and I became the director over there. And what was happening is we were talking to families who were really overwhelmed and stressed because their child was struggling in school for a number of reasons. And so Oxford had this incredible assessment that they would do and help people to start figuring out like what are in regards to the executive functioning and all of that, how to be able to help them. And so I would be talking with them and helping them to understand what that assessment looked like and truly walking through and seeing, is it going to be a good fit for them to be able to work with us in regards for us helping their child, for them to come to us after school, sometimes 3 to 4 times a week for years to be able to give them the support that they need. And so just showing them a pretty brochure or the assessment itself and just kind of going through it line by line by line, that was not going to make a very big difference for them. They needed to understand that I knew what they were going through. They needed to know that I truly cared for their child and how we were going to be able to help them. Features and benefits don't do that as well as story can. Now, I'm going to say this again. Features and benefits are very good. You need both. You need both things to be able to show them, like, so they can see visually, but they can also hear the stories behind it. And so that's how it came into play. When we are having those higher ticket sales conversations, just a brochure isn't going to cut it. And us just walking them through that brochure, just line by line, is not going to cut it. We need to be able to use story.
Yeah, and I think like I had an experience this week where I was talking with a potential referral partner that I had met, and we were following up. We were at some meetings together a few weeks ago, and so I was talking to them, and I had shared some of the materials. He had looked at our website and all of that, and so he felt like I was credible enough to have the conversation with. But when we got on the call, I didn't need to go over all that stuff again. He was already convinced of that. And so what he wanted to know was, hey, like, is this person trustworthy? Does this person have some stories of how he's worked with people? And so we were able to do that, and at the appropriate time in the conversation, have some of those stories to tell, because the promotional material had done its job, and now it was time to connect like person to person. All right, so how do we tell stories? Typically, stories have a little bit of a framework, and stories that sell probably have a little bit of a framework too. So what are the different pieces of stories that sell? Where would you start?
Yes, so the very first thing I would start with is the story has to have a problem. And more importantly, that problem needs to be the problem that they just shared with you. So we talk about this in our service framework. This is the V in verbalizing the value. This is where this starts to come into play. We talk about a lot in regards that we're not talking about what we do, what we offer, how we can help until we truly know the problems that they're facing. So that way it makes sense and we can build that bridge and connect the dots. And so the first piece is we need to know the problem. We have to have the actual problem.
Yeah, so like in your framework, so the R in service is recognize the problem, and then the V is verbalize the value. And so this is the transition point, right? Now, help me understand. You breezed through that a little bit. Just come back and review what do you mean when you say it has to be the problem that they talked about or that they shared?
Yes. So when we're talking and we're having the sales conversation and we're beginning to understand the problems that are driving them and motivating them, and that probably would be another episode that we would be talking about at some point. But when we're understanding those, that's what our story is going to start to relate to. That is what that problem is going to be. If we bring in an example of a customer that we've worked with before or a family that we've worked with before, and it's not connecting to the problem they've just shared with us, we are actually hurting ourselves, because now in their mind, they're thinking, that's not really me though. I don't really understand that. And so then they start to devalue what it is you're trying to offer them.
Yeah, a lot of times I think it's easy we have a product or service and we know that this product and service in general relates to a certain set of problems or a certain set of issues. And those may be the most common, but that doesn't mean that any particular customer is feeling those or is verbalizing
Right.
those. And even if they do
Right.
ultimately have those problems, that's not the part that's keeping them up at night. And so
Right.
so it's easy, like, oh, we've done this. Like, I know, here's my all this stuff, but you're saying for it to be really important or really impactful in selling, it has to relate to what they're thinking and feeling.
Yes. And specifically, we don't have to make it up because we have been talking to them. And so we are just going to reiterate what they had already told us. That's where we get into, I don't want to say the word problem so many times, but that's where we will get stuck as the sales professional, as we're having that sales conversation. We start trying to fix something that they didn't even bring up. And that's not what we do. We are listening, we are understanding when we believe we found what's actually bothering them, because that's when they start telling us stories about the problem that they're having. Now we're saying, okay, so who have I worked with in the past? What has happened in the past that can directly relate to the problem they just shared with me? Meaning you can't just have one story that you pull out of your pocket every single time, because it may not actually be the problem they're facing.
Yeah, so we need to collect a lot of good stories. And I would just highlight, this is a moment where, whether Brooke has been teaching at a conference or with her coaching, lots of people kind of have a light bulb type of moment with this. And they're like, oh, you mean like what they just said is what the story relates to, and that. And so Brooke gave you a little bit of insight there, and you can always reach out to her and think about her Sales Accelerator Lab or wherever, where you can learn all sorts of this stuff. So the first thing is recognize the problem. The next part is what? So our story has a problem.
Yes. Then the next piece is it needs to be relatable. So we just talked about how it needs to be the right problem, because I say this all the time. If we get the problem wrong, everything starts to fall apart. But now we have the problem that they're sharing. So we do marketing consulting and sales coaching. So let's just give an example of one of ours. And they're saying, hey, you know what? My sales are down. Okay, that would be like a surface problem, but like what's actually going on underneath? As we continue to talk, the reason why they're hesitant to work with a sales trainer is they've done that before. It didn't work. They didn't feel like they could connect to the team. They didn't feel like that they were getting the support that they needed. And then if we keep digging, they're like, not only that, they just never talked to me again. It was like one and done. They talked and then it was gone. And then they didn't have any idea of how their team was doing or what was going on. So that's what I mean when we start digging down a little bit deeper. So now we can start to share a story of how we were able to work with a client in regards to what was happening with the communication, because that's the main issue. The main issue is not my sales are down. The main issue is I know my sales are down. I got to do something about it. But the main issue of whether I want to work with you or not is, can I trust you to actually lead my team? And are you going to communicate with me better than what happened before? So that's when you bring that story in.
And I was just thinking as you were talking about, like, sometimes those circumstances are from way long ago. So as an example, and you may not even know this, but I took karate lessons when I was somewhere around 7 to whatever years old at the
I did not know this.
Right, at the YMCA. And my dad would take me and we'd sit in there, and all the guy did was tell like stories about his karate exploits, and he never really taught. So then when our son 40 years later is thinking about joining karate, I come in and I'm like, one of my things was, okay, we think this is good, our neighbors had a good experience, I want to make sure this guy isn't just gonna tell stories about how he won all these tournaments and all of that.
Wow. Ladies and gentlemen, you just peeled the curtain back and saw into our marriage. I had no idea. Yeah. And now our son has a black belt. He's worked really, really hard.
Yeah, but that's when awesome. You find out like the real problem, then you can tell the stories, and it's a lot of times the problems aren't like with you. There's stuff you're offering. It's stuff that's happened in the past, maybe even a long time ago.
And that is so true. And that's how it comes back to, it wouldn't have mattered to you if he sat you down and then he was giving you a brochure or walking through it. It's not that was bad necessarily, but you still had that feeling inside of, I don't really know if this is going to be a good experience for my son. Like, I don't need him to be listening to a bunch of people just bragging on themselves all the time. And that was not it. And by them able to share what was going on, how they're working with the kids, all of that, I mean, we decided to sign them up, so something worked.
Yeah, it worked to the tune of 6 years of karate lessons. So, yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
That is a great example, Scott. So yes, so it has to be relatable in regards to that they can see themselves in what's going on. And so again, we're relating it because they've just shared with us what's happening. So we're beginning to make those connections. What you're doing though is you want to be careful is you don't want to just be thinking about what you're going to be saying next while they're talking. This is something that would be helpful for you to do beforehand. Like just start thinking about it and being like, okay, what are the main issues, those motivating issues for most of my customers? And what could be some stories that I've had in the past with other people that could help in regards to those issues that they were facing? And I just want to say it one more time. It is usually not the deliverable that they're having a problem with. It's because in regards to service-based industries, if they didn't have a problem with the person they worked with before, they would not be coming to you. So either what happened is it didn't work, or that person just like, maybe they left, maybe they moved, heaven forbid, maybe they died, and that's why they had to find someone new. No one looks for new help unless something is going wrong. And it's never really the deliverables. It's not actually the deliverables. Sometimes it can be, but then that's a really easy one to solve because it was like, well, that person was just kind of a complete fluke and they did not do anything that they said they were going to do. And so then we go from there. But just to encourage yourself, as sales professionals, as we have these sales conversations, we tend to think it's our deliverables and it's and it's usually not. That is not the reason they're usually looking for somebody else.
Yeah, and I think the other part, and you mentioned it there, but just to drill into it a little bit more, you talk a lot about telling stories about motivations and people's thoughts and all of that. And what that allows you to do is to use a lot of different circumstances that then become more relatable. So if you were, for example, if you were telling to like a solopreneur a story about how you worked with this multinational $1 million, like multi-millions, the business, they would like click out and say, oh, that doesn't relate to me because that's not my business. But you can tell that same story and focus on the specific person that you were talking with and the frustrations and the fears that they have. And then all of a sudden, it's a much more relatable story because you focused on sort of the shared human experience, not getting lost in all the, hey, I worked with Nike or, whatever.
No, that's absolutely true. Which then leads to like our third point. Okay, we have to have a problem in our story. It has to be relatable. And then the last piece is there has to be like a resolution. But in it, and this goes completely back to story brand, you need the customer to be the hero in that. So many times when we feel like, okay, now I've got to like prove myself, I got to prove why they need to work with me, we make ourselves the hero. And in our story, we just start talking about all the amazing things we did for that client. That is not going to help. They need to see how you came alongside that client and how the client won the day. That is the most important. And that has to come across in that story. If it doesn't, it's just oh, well, that's great. You're successful. I'm still stuck. What are we supposed to be doing? And you don't want that.
Yeah, and the reality is, if you want to call it a humble brag or whatever, is when you tell those stories where your customers or where your clients were successful, it's simultaneously showing, oh, I actually know what I'm doing because there was a result. But you don't have to talk about that part so much. You can talk about the transformation that came from your client's perspective and the help that was brought to them.
Yeah, and what they saw and how it helped them. There's nothing wrong because also in regards to service-based industries, a lot of times we talk about like the return of investment and those things. And so those are great things to be able to share. But again, you can share that, but always making sure that it's continuing to be directed towards how that customer won instead of how you turned their business around or whatever the case is. You can still share how you were able to help, but also including how they were able to be successful. Because if it's just about you, that's not what you want. If it's just like, well, hey, I worked with this university and I grew it by 30%. Okay, that's nice, but more so like we were able to work with the team so that they could feel confident and continue to grow, which resulted in growing it by 30%. That's what you're showing.
All right, we've sort of got our framework, right? So make sure your story has a problem and that problem comes from your customer.
Yes.
Literally the words that they spoke.
Yes.
Second, make the story relatable. And you can do that by focusing on the human motivations and emotions and that type of thing. And then thirdly, like, there has to be a resolution. Mm-hmm. Typically, like in sales, it might be a good resolution of positive success and how you've done that. But focusing on not your greatness in this circumstance, but the transformation, the improvement, the impact that what you did brought, how it changed another customer or client's life. So
yes.
Sorry,
and also if I can just give a bonus, like, details matter. We do not want to bore someone with the story, but if it sounds really vague and they're like, oh, that could be anything, then that's not what we're looking for. So like and we talk about this at StoryBrand, and they give like a great framework in regards to how to get testimonials and what we want your testimonials to look like. And it's very similar. Like, you want to help them to see, like, they were in this position first. This was the problem that they were facing. This is what happened when we started getting involved, and this is the result. That's how you want to be able to bring it through, so that it's specific enough that they can feel like, oh, this really happened. She's not just saying something. She's not just trying to come up with something on the fly. So details matter.
Yeah, and that's why we try to, like, in our conversations, have specific stories and tell specific things, because the reality is that even though when you're specific enough, you can tell. Like, I can almost guarantee that with the exception of maybe 15 other families in Springfield, Ohio in the 1980s that went to the YMCA for karate lessons, nobody else experienced that. But I can also guarantee that probably people heard that story and were like, oh yeah, like, I see how that relates and how that applies, because it wasn't just so vanilla generic story.
Yes.
Of that. So
exactly.
Well, here's the bottom line. Whether it was last week, if you haven't heard that episode, go back and hear that one, or this week, the trick is, don't make the stories all about you. Discover your customers' stories and what they're facing, and then tell stories that relate and that celebrate the successes other people have had, and all the details of you in that are much less important. Mm-hmm. Well, that's it. We'll be back next week. We're roaring into the Roaring 20s. There we go. The Roaring 20s. Yay! Podcast, episode 21. We'll look forward to having you join us. Thanks. Have a great day.
Yes, but next week, Scott won't be joining us. Dr. Reverend Scott Green will be joining us.
Yes, I will officially be done. So thank you all.
Okay.
I'll expect, I don't know what I'll expect. So more of the same. Have a great day, everybody.
Bye.